Welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. Last week, we were introduced to a handful of the people responsible for the founding of the city, and we were introduced to the early 19th century. Today, we are going to talk about one of the founding conflicts that we had to clip over in the last episode, the War of 1812. In this episode, we're going to look at the situation that led up to the war. Then next week, we'll go over the war itself and the aftermath and what that meant for society going forward. The War of 1812 was named so because it kinda started in 1812, but then continued on until 1814 officially, but really the fighting didn't stop until 1815. In the UK, it's called the War of 1812 in America, as 1812 was remembered more for Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia. The maxim of "don't invade Russia in the winter unless you're the Mongols, because the rules don't apply to them," was noted, so the Little Corporal invaded in June. But winter came that year, as it did every year, and inspired Tchaikovsky to inspire children towards the classics for generations to come. Over here, on the North American continent, the American War of Independence had been over for 29 years. Grown men and women could recall their parents or grandparents telling them about the war, as this was a part of the founding myth of the United States, and still is for that matter. But it was also central to the culture of Lower, and particularly Upper, Canada. Upper and Lower Canada, along with the Maritimes, had undergone a huge settlement boom in the wake of the war. And while the fury of the expulsion had certainly died down, the savagery of the war and the refugee crisis it instigated was one of the few shared elements of the culture across Upper Canada. Most of the early settlers that we've met over the past couple of episodes have been born and bred Yankees from New England, not from Old Blighty. While soldiers, bureaucrats, and other officials would come over from the British Isles, most Upper Canada settlements were the results of northward migration. This migration was not limited to the War of Refugees, but it also included what were referred to as late Loyalists, Americans who saw the cheap availability of land in the Canadas and the chaotic life in the wake of the American Revolution, and decided to take the oath to King George III and settle in the peaceable kingdom to the north. Filman Wright would be a prime example of this phenomenon. Another, I'll say connection, because bond might prove a little too strong. Another connection between the Canadas and the newly independent United States was that of commerce. There was a great deal of trade across the Great Lakes, but especially in the Maritimes. The border between Maine and New Brunswick took years to settle because people kept moving and engaging in shared commerce, particularly in the shipbuilding and lumber trades. Communities of faith also crossed the lands of Washington and the lands of London. The Anglican Communion, founded by the mores of various Tudors, particularly Henry VIII, was the largest confession in Upper Canada and the Maritimes. But Presbyterianism and Catholicism were also numerically significant. This was echoed in the United States with three major differences. The first was that there were much fewer Catholics due to the significantly smaller French population. The second was that in 1789, the Anglican Church in the United States rebranded itself as Episcopalian, meaning governed by bishops, and getting rid of the pesky King George is the defender of the faith trait after the war. Loyalty to the state, while following the religion of another, potentially hostile state, was an issue back then, and to varying degrees still is. The third religious difference was that because America was a land, not of cities, but of small communities, the centralization of Anglicanism or Episcopalianism, or Roman Catholicism, gave way to more localized religious movements, such as those of the Methodists and the Baptists, and later the Mormons, but also dozens of religious movements whose numbers never merited much study. Baptists and evangelicals were counted among the Loyalists who migrated into North America, who maintained closer connections with their co-religionists across the border, back home we might say, as these religious traditions were based there and didn't enjoy the same popularity among the British establishment. 9 Presbyterian or Reformed, 6 Church of England, 5 Baptists, 5 Catholics, 5 Mennonites, and 1 lonely Lutheran. While records reflect that Anglicanism was the most widespread of the religious practices, there being just as many Baptists, half again as many Presbyterians, and twice as many Methodists, is worth noting for understanding the direction of change in the province. Most of the province was made up of small settlements, so while there were established churches in York, Kingston, and other towns, most of the clerics were itinerant, traveling from community to community and preaching, often outdoors. This was a similar religious environment to the American states, and quite different from the religious communities of England, where physical churches and ecclesiastical orders were more particularly arrayed. When war would erupt across the border, many individuals and families counted kin on both sides of the border and did business across the border and prayed with their brethren across the border. These were not two populations wholly independent of each other. They were more like a separated family, with the War of 1812 serving as the final divorce. For the Haudenosaunee, their 2 largest territories were Iroquois in Upper New York State and the Grand River settlement in modern-day southern Ontario. These groups didn't just claim kinship with one another in a metaphysical sense, but a legal and political sense. British North America and the United States of America both had independent treaties with the Haudenosaunee as a nation. They were not viewed as the reductionist Native Americans, in a way similar to how Vatican City is an independent country despite being completely surrounded by the Italian Republic. Tyendinaga, Grand River, and Iroquois were all irredentist territories of the Haudenosaunee Nation, despite being surrounded by either the USA or British North America. Kahnawake and Kanesatake were territories of the St. Lawrence Iroquois. Both contained some Anishinaabe as well, which actually overlapped the border between the 2 settler countries in Lower Canada. The Algonquin, on the other hand, were completely surrounded by British North America, mostly in Lower Canada, but with some territory in what the British called Upper Canada, but had yet to settle. Largely in the Upper Ottawa Valley, in Pembroke, and upriver from there. They saw themselves as allies of the Crown, though it was increasingly obvious that the Crown didn't see them as allies so much as subject peoples. When the lion lies with the lamb, it's the lion that sleeps comfortably. In the almost 30 years since the Revolutionary War, the Loyalists were spreading gradually across the Canadas, but Americans were spreading out of their former colonies with wholehearted abandon. In times past, they were held back to the coastal settlements by the Allegheny Mountains, by treaties with the indigenous nations, and by a British army that wanted the colonists kept in check. Without the threat of force from the centralized government in Britain, the decentralized governments of the states were powerless to stop individual settlers, or rather settler companies, from ignoring state treaties, state laws, state edicts, by simply stepping across the line where those state authorities magically dissipated into the ether of legislative non-existence. American settlers crossed the mountains in larger numbers every year, driving west into the Northern Territory. That's the American one, not the Canadian one. Northern Territory is, admittedly, the John Smith of place names. Americans moved into the Ohio Valley, the Illinois Territory, the other lands that had been forbidden to them, simply because some non-white people claimed it belonged to them. Settlers continued to expand their control westward over the territories, until the entire southern side of the Great Lakes was controlled by these expatriate Americans, bringing their country's ways with them. The state of Ohio was formed and admitted in 1803 as the 17th state, while the rest of the Great Lakes would still be administered as a territory. Another motivation, simmering under the surface, was the American myth-making of bestowing upon themselves the laurels of freedom, and the British the enslaver's chain. Many of the more idealistic or ideological American demagogues would believe that the revolution that brought freedom to the Americas was an unfinished revolution, while their brothers north of New England remained in subjugation to the tyrant George III. When the American general William Hull crossed from Detroit into Windsor, he believed that Canada was America but for the marching, and that the Canadians would rejoice as Americans brought forth what he called liberty, security, and wealth that Americans enjoyed, unless they preferred war, slavery, and destruction. This would set a precedent for Americans invading other countries for their own good, only to be surprised when the popular resistance broke out. This has happened so many times over the years that I don't really think I need to present a list. The final factor setting up the war was another war, or rather a series of wars, called the Napoleonic Wars as a group. Though individually there were really 7 different wars, numbered by coalitions, for example, the War of the Seventh Coalition. 8 wars if you include the War of 1812 in America, but I think that they're distinct enough to separate. At the time, the United States was economically dependent on trade, and Napoleon was proclaiming an embargo on Britain. And Britain had declared an embargo on Napoleon, which is to say almost all of Europe at the time. For a trading power like the United States, the world's largest markets were effectively closed. Prime Minister Spencer Perceval went so far as to issue orders in council insisting that any American ship heading to Europe would have to first harbor in Britain to pay tax before continuing along to Europe. Perceval was assassinated by a Liverpool merchant who blamed the Prime Minister for his financial ruin in May of 1812. And the new Prime Minister, Robert Jenkinson, also of Liverpool, overturned the hated Orders in Council. In order to continue waging the seemingly never-ending Napoleonic Wars, which lasted for 12 years, from 1803 to 1815, the British needed more and more men to throw into the meat grinder of combat and produce the sausage of victory. In the mission of collecting more souls for this sacred duty, they advocated the policy of forced recruitment, or impressment to use the term of the times. The Royal Navy would stop ships, and if they felt that the sailors were British subjects, then they owed the Crown service. Now, in the days before everyone had a passport, social insurance, or other civic documentation, the process of determining citizenship was a tad more complicated. Some sailors would show an eagle tattoo to prove they were American and not British. How strong are your R's when you say farmer? Are there 2 R's, like a heathen North American? Or were they both subsumed by vowels in the King's English, as farmer? Maybe they disappear, but in a non-rhotic Boston dialect, farmer. Without documents, identifying nationality when 2 nations shared a language was a challenge. Many American sailors were from Britain, but had made homes in the former colonies and become American. Some might have joined the American merchant fleets after being pressed into the Royal Navy. Many Americans were forcefully conscripted into the British service, despite never having set foot on British soil. It was a confusing and convoluted situation. On 22 June 1807, there was a scuffle between the American frigate, the USS Chesapeake, and a British warship, the HMS Leopard, off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia. The Chesapeake got off only 1 shot after being hit by Leopard's broadsides and surrendered. The Chesapeake was boarded. 4 members of its crew were deemed to be deserters from the Royal Navy. 1 was hanged. The other 3 were brought back into service aboard the Leopard. This was the talk of the news for weeks in the United States, with Thomas Jefferson threatening the British ambassador, and the Chesapeake's captain, James Barron, was court-martialed and relieved of command. The end result was the embargo of 1807. The general embargo ended trade with belligerent powers, in this case Great Britain and France. Even though American public sentiment was still incited after the Chesapeake Leopard incident, New England's economy was built on trade with Europe, and opposition to Jefferson was strongest there. While Britain eventually acquiesced to American demand for neutral trade, they maintained the right to recapture deserting sailors and maintained that their indigenous allies deserved to maintain their territorial integrity in the face of the aggressive American imperial policy of manifest destiny. And with that, the British and the Americans walked happily towards a war that was as avoidable as it was inevitable. It would become known as the Second American War of Independence in the United States at the time, and would become etched into the Canadian psyche as Canada's War of Independence, fighting off the challenge of the aggressive southern neighbor. We're going to close this episode of the podcast here and continue next week with the war itself. If you'd like a list of references about the War of 1812, please take a visit to the website at ottawahistoryhub.com. You can follow me on Facebook and Blue Sky as Ottawa History Hub, or on X Twitter at OttHistoryHub. That's OTTHISTORYHUB. You can also send me an email at ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com. Have a good week, everybody, and advance Ottawa en avant!